This lecture is going to cover a really large group, the Mollusca. So here are the groups that we've covered thus far. So we started off with these basal lineages. Then we moved over to the bilateral animals, and we covered the first protostomes, the platyhelminths and the rotifers. And now we're moving over to this clade to the left, which the first members we're going to look at are the mollusks. Now notice I've got a synapomorphy for this clade, the trochophore larva. We're going to see that the mollusks have a number of larval forms. One of these, the earliest form, is one that is actually shared with the annelid worms. As I mentioned, this is a big group, a very large clade, over 80,000 recognized species, and probably more than that that need to be scientifically named. And they also show a great morphological diversity. We're going to see that this is relatively a truism, that a group that's very diverse as far as number of species also are morphologically diverse. Those kind of go hand in hand. And this gives them the ability, this morphological diversity is associated with their exploitation of a wide range of habitats. So they're basically in all habitats: freshwater, marine, polar waters, tropical waters, and some of them have even invaded the terrestrial environment. So here are some examples. So we have a chitin, we have a snail, we have a nudibranch, a sea slug, an octopus, and some bivalves. So some synapomorphies associated with this group include a posterior mantle cavity with one or more paired gills. Now in the terrestrial forms, the gills have been lost and replaced with a lung, we'll see, but this is an early synapomorphy for the group. They have a radula, a feeding structure that we'll talk about in more detail. We'll also talk in great detail about their muscular foot that is used for locomotion, and the mantle itself that creates the mantle cavity that we discussed above. The mantle is a tissue that surrounds the body and actually secretes the shell in most mollusks. We're only going to look at some of the major clades within the mollusk. So the first clade that we'll look at are the gastropods. This is the largest group of mollusks, and it's the only one that also has terrestrial representatives. And again, that kind of makes sense to what I told you earlier. The more diverse a group is, the more habitats it typically is associated with. And so this is a group that can be found in freshwater, marine waters, and also in the terrestrial environment. So it includes snails and slugs, and we're going to see that it has some interesting developmental traits associated with this group. We'll also investigate the bivalves. These are the two-shelled mollusks. That's what bivalvia actually means. It includes clams, oysters, mussels, some of the best eating of this group. And mollusks also include the cephalopods, the most derived as far as their bodies go, highly modified bodies. Most living forms lack shells except for the nautiloids. There are only a few species of nautiloids that live currently. There is an old fossil record associated with the nautiloids. It used to be a much more diverse group. But today, most of the cephalopods that you see are represented by the octopuses and the squids. These animals are triploblastic, bilaterally symmetrical, and some of them do show a high degree of cephalization, but this varies, and it varies depending primarily on their locomotion abilities. This is the first group that is a eucoelomate. So these are our first eucoelomate animals. And remember, a coelomate is defined by having an internal body cavity, but unlike the pseudocoelomates in which just the outside of that body cavity is lined by mesoderm, now we have the endoderm also lined by mesoderm to give us this fully enclosed mesodermal pouch, which is the true coelom, the eucoelomate condition. It's a relatively small coelom. It's restricted to the areas just around the heart and the gonads and the metanephridia, the excretory structures. As I mentioned, much of the body is surrounded by this epithelial sheet of tissue called the mantle. And so here we can see the mantle up close. Here we can also see it with its several folds. And on the outside of that, we can see that it is where we see the shell in this bivalve. So the mantle actually secretes this shell. In some cases, it secretes these plates or sclerites, but in most mollusks, it secretes a shell. The folds of the mantle actually create the mantle cavity that contains the gills or the ctenidia, So ctenidia is just another version, another name, a synonymous name for the gills. And we're going to see that the gills in mollusks serve two functions, both feeding and also for respiration. We also see that there are openings to the gut, excretory and reproductive systems that empty into the mantle cavity before the digestive waste, the excretory waste, and the eggs or sperm are released to the environment through the mantle cavity. And also associated with the gills, we have the osphragma. This is a ciliated chemosensory structure that we'll see is an important sensory structure in mollusks, most mollusks. Again, the cephalopods are really modified their body a lot, and one aspect of that is their epithelium. So they have these chromatophores in their epithelium that allow them to change colors really rapidly. So they can produce these really complex color patterns and can actually flash these colors by changing the size of their chromatophores by minute muscular contractions. So some of the patterns that they can produce are camouflage, so they can basically blend into the background. Other cases, they can make aposematic colors, so colors that are warning colors, saying that you better stay away because I'm dangerous, or I taste bad, or I could bite you and inject some venom. We'll talk about the blue-ringed octopus is highly venomous. In social context, sometimes the color changes are associated with two males trying to exert dominance over each other, or in some cases a male trying to convince a female to mate with him in a breeding or courtship display. Some deep sea species of cephalopods are known to produce bioluminescence as well, and this may help them in capturing prey. As I mentioned, most mollusks have an external shell or plates or at least sclerites embedded within the mantle to give them some support. So these are hard calcareous structures, again, secreted by the mantle. And the shell is actually composed of layers that are laid down by the mantle. So layers of proteins and calcium-based crystals that are integrated together to give you that hard shell. And if you've ever wondered where pearls come from, well, pearls basically are the same material that's used to make the shell that are covering foreign bodies that have invaded the mantle, between the mantle and the shell. They irritate the mantle, and so they actually try to soothe that by creating the pearls themselves that become embedded within the mantle. So not all mollusks have shells. Some do not have one, and they may only have sclerites only and be basically soft organisms. And the shell has been lost or reduced multiple times in things like slugs. Cuttlefish just have a very small internal shell. Squid have even a further reduction, and then octopuses completely lack any type of hard skeletal material and rely solely on hydrodynamic pressure. One of the groups we're not going to really talk about too much, the chitons. I showed you a picture one earlier. These are the ones that have these plates, and multiple plates are overlapping. We call these the polyplecophrans. But you don't have to remember that one. We're not really going to talk too much about that group. In some cases, we see a single-shelled mollusk, and they can be uncoiled or coiled, and coiled shells are very common in the gastropods, and we'll talk about how that is associated with modifications of the bodies in the land snails. The bivalves, they're named because they come in paired shells, so mussels, oysters, clams. And different shell architectures have different adaptive functions. So just in general, they're good for predator defense. They're a nice hard structure to keep the soft parts of the body protected. In the chitons, which I mentioned earlier, the polyplecophrans, these plates are covering a soft body that can create this nice suction. The foot can stick onto a hard surface, but the hydrodynamic flat shell of these plates also allows them to resist the wave action so that they don't get pulled off from those hard structures that they're kind of glued onto. As I mentioned, a lot of the gastropod shells are coiled, and they actually rest asymmetrically on the animal's body. So it's kind of like they're carrying a backpack and they're kind of humping it up on one side of their body. This actually leads to a reduction or a loss of the organs on the right side of their body. So they only have one ctenidium, a gonad, the ossifradium, that sensory structure, and the metanephridium, the excretory structure. So these are on the left side only, and they're actually enlarged compared to other mollusks that have paired ones, where those duties are shared between the paired organs. The nautiloids have chambered shells, and the animals actually only live in the outermost chamber. And so as they grow, they create new chambers where the body is moved just to that outer chamber. These interior chambers are a mix of water and gases, and this mixture is actually controlled by this straw-like structure that runs between them, which is called the siphuncle. So the siphuncle is an adaptation and a synapomorphy for the cephalopods. What the siphuncle does is it controls the mixture of water and gases, and the animals can dynamically change this at different times of the day, and this controls what level they're going to be able to float at. So you want to kind of go up, then you remove some of the water from the chambers and you put more gases in those chambers. Go down, then you fill these with more water and less gas. As I mentioned, there have been a number of cases where the shell has been lost. This reduces weight and provides for more quick, more agile movements seen in some of the gastropods and the cephalopods. So think about this squid. They can swim very agilely and very quickly. Octopi can occupy very small spaces to escape predators by having this very fluid body that they can squeeze into tight spaces. Nudibranchs can crawl around more efficiently without a shell. That does pose a potential danger to them because they've lost this protective shell, but we're talking about some of the defenses that they have to deal with that. Mollusks have really well-developed muscular systems that include circular, longitudinal, and diagonal muscle fibers. The ventral muscular foot is the most well-developed in most of these organisms. This is the primary structure associated with locomotion. I mean, these well-developed muscular systems are why we like to eat mollusks so much. There's a lot of nice, tasty meat in these animals. Bivalves have these large muscles to close their shells. So we have these adductor muscles. And the adductor muscles can relax and the shell can open. When they close, that can hold the shell closed. Cephalopods have really complex musculature associated with their mantle, the mantle cavity, the funnel, the tentacles and arms that are extending around the mouth. This allows for very powerful and refined movements in these cephalopods. As far as the nervous system goes, they have a very well-developed nervous system with an anterior nerve ring, which you can see here, surrounding the gut tract. It then has ventral nerves that run the length of the body with these interconnecting transverse nerves running the length of the body. On the anterior end, that you see that they have a number of peripheral nerves that are connected, the ganglia, to sensory structures associated with the head. So this is in those that show a high degree of cephalization. So it's the moving ones, the mollusks that are moving. You see less of that sensory structures and less of a well-developed ganglion associated with a head in the more sedentary sessile form. So again, the cephalization really varies with locomotion ability. You have high cephalization, more mobile taxa, like the gastropods, like snails in this case. You can see they have a big brain. In the case of the cephalopods, it's the most well-developed. But in something like a bivalve where they're not moving, they do have a region where there is coordination of sensory structures, but it's not really linked also to a concentration of sensory structures. So it's reduced cephalization in that regard. So when we talk about the sensory structures that we see in mollusks, the foot is really a high concentration of chemosensory and mechanosensory tissues, so that they can know kind of what they're crawling over. The suckers on the arms of cephalopods also have a lot of chemosensory structures and mechanosensory structures, so again that they can basically feel and taste what they're touching. This again is a synapomorphy for the mollusk, the Osmoregulation. This is again, ciliated chemosensory structure associated with the ctenidia, so that they can basically taste the water that they're bringing into the mantle cavity. This is going to be very important because we're going to see that the ctenidia, one of the big functions, is in feeding. Not all mollusks have eyes, but there has been the independent evolution of eyes in multiple cases in mollusks, and they vary in complexity. Some just basically light sensing structures, but in some cases they can actually form a visual picture of their environment similar to the capabilities we have, and maybe even more efficient If you look at the way that the eye is put together, it's actually more efficient in cephalopods than it is in vertebrates. So they have a lens, they have the cornea and the pupil here, and we see that there's an image that is concentrated on the retina, and then large optic nerves can send this information to the brain. And you can clearly see that in something like an octopus or a squid. Here, however, we have a scallop. So some bivalves also have multiple eyes. These little blue things that look like blueberries, these are actually eyes. And it's been shown that these also send a visual signal to these organisms. The cephalopods have the largest cerebral ganglia than any other mollusk. They form the lobes of the brain. It's larger than any other mollusk, but also larger than any other invertebrate. This gives them lots of sensory capabilities, so we already talked about how good their vision is, but it also gives them the capability of higher cognitive abilities. They can learn mazes really quickly. They can remember patterns when tested in a laboratory setting. And octopuses can even kind of build shelters to protect themselves, which is important. If you're going to lose your protective shell for agility, it would make sense also that you get smarter and know how to deal effectively with predator attacks. As I mentioned, the muscular foot is really key for locomotion. The bottom is called the sole, and it can be glandular that creates this nice mucus path that they can move on, and ciliated so that it moves them through this like creeping motion. But they can also use their, creep along these mucus trails, but they can also use their foot to burrow themselves in soft sediments to make kind of more undulating muscular contractions for faster movement. And as I mentioned, the polyplecophrans, the chitons, can create a cup in a vacuum to firmly attach to a hard substrate in rocky tidal regions to resist the wave action. The bivalves have these really long, kind of knife-shaped feet, or a foot for an individual, and they use this to both pull themselves forward so they can extend this foot to make it really thin, then wedge it into the sediment, and they can create a little anchor at the distal tip, and then contractions of the foot can drag themselves forward. But the foot also has muscles that will allow them to push themselves off, almost like a pole vaulter, kind of moving themselves through the sediment. And some species can open and close their valves quick enough in some of the bivalves, such as the scallop shown here in the bottom right. They can use muscular contractions of those shell adductor muscles to open and close really quickly the shell, and use jet propulsion to swim away from a very slow predator like these sea stars. So not only can the scallops swim, but they don't really swim in a very elegant manner. Swimming has evolved independently in other mollusk lineages. So in the gastropods, we see these gastropods which are called sea butterflies, shown here on the left. They have these modified foots for forming paddles in some of the nudibranchs, these modified foot extensions. So both of these have modifications of the foot for making flipper-like structures. The cephalopods can generate these really powerful jet propulsive blasts of water from their mantle cavity, concentrated through the funnel as shown here, and there are muscles surrounding the funnel that can control the direction and the size of the opening to control the propulsive force. Octopuses can also crawl using their arms. They can both swim and crawl. Some mollusks don't want to move. They want to remain sessile, want to be immobile, and some of these can cement themselves to a hard surface. So oysters can make these hard oyster beds by cementing themselves together or to hard substrate. Some other bivalves use what are called byssal threads to attach themselves to solid structures, as you can see in this muscle up on top. And some bivalves can bury themselves in soft sediments or actually bore into solid structures. So we got some burrowing bivalves on the left, and the strange looking organism on the right is actually called a ship worm, which is actually a mollusk. And it actually burrows into wooden structures like old ships or piers and can be very damaging. So again, that's why they're called ship worms. Many of the mollusks are suspension or detritus feeders, so they're eating very small food particles. And they're using their ciliated ctenidia to capture these suspended food particles or food particles that are in the detritus. These particles are captured in mucus that's created by the ctenidia and then driven to a pair of what are called labial palps, shown here, that surround the mouth, and this is where food is sorted from the non-digestible material, and the food is actually pushed into the digestive tract. Then the non-digested material is released back into the mantle cavity for ejection. Once it gets into the digestive tract, that's where the radula comes into play. The radula is this tongue-like strip of tissue with rows of teeth embedded within it. So kind of think about it as being almost like a conveyor belt of teeth. And it's used to scrape food particles from larger food items. So here we can see this strip of tissue that has the radular teeth in it. The tooth type actually varies among mollusks depending on what they eat. So there are tooth shapes that are better at dealing with herbivorous diets and some that are better at dealing with carnivorous diets, just like we see in a lot of terrestrial animals. The most highly modified tooth form, though, radula, is the radular teeth associated with conus species. These are gastropods that produce these harpoons that can be ejected into larger prey, like large fish, and deliver a toxin to immobilize that prey, where they then can move that prey into their mouth, like you can see down here on the bottom right. The cephalopods have these beak-like structures. It kind of looks like the bill of a parrot that is used to capture and immobilize larger prey items before they are actually broken up by the radula. So here you can see an external view of this beak, and here you can see a section of a squid that shows both the jaws, these beak-like jaws, and then the interior radula. There's a great deal of specialization of the digestive tract. So the stomach is often composed of different chambers and structures for breakdown of food. There's a crop that's often used to store larger food items as they're awaiting digestion. And herbivorous species, like we see in a lot of herbivorous mammals, have gizzards. These gizzards are muscular structures that are used to crunch up food with embedded teeth for additional mastication after the radula has done its job. Bivalves have an interesting structure called the crystalline style that's in their stomach, and what this does, it's again in bivalves and some gastropods, there's cilia that actually rotate this free-floating crystalline style. As it spins, it draws this mucus cord with food through the digestive tract. So here we can see that the mouth would be out here. We've got the esophagus, where we can see this rotating mucus cord drawing food into the body, which some of that is going to go to different parts of the stomach and intestines for digestion from the stomach here. But also, as the crystalline style rotates, it rubs against this gastric shield, which releases digestive enzymes that helps to break down the food that's being brought in. Most mollusks have a partially open circulatory system, and this means they have a prominent blood cavity called the hemostyle, with different blood sinuses that are interconnected by short blood vessels that provide a little bit of closure to the system. The blood moves through the body through a heart. In some cases there are additional heart as well, but usually there's one main heart that's found in a pericardial chamber. The atria receive oxygenated blood from the ctenidia, and there are usually vessels that are associated with the ctenidia that are taking in oxygenated blood and bringing it to the heart. So the atria of the heart is receiving oxygenated blood from the ctenidia, and the ventricle is actually pumping that blood to various blood sinuses that are spread throughout the body and then make it back to the ctenidia with deoxygenated blood. The cephalopods actually have a closed circulatory system. So they have a heart with accessory pumping hearts that provide higher blood pressure and more efficient, faster transport of materials that make their more agile, quick lifestyle possible. As far as respiration goes, most of these are aquatic and have ctenidia or gills. They're used for gas exchange. The water flow through the mantle cavity is created using the ciliated ctenidia. Now in the cephalopods, because again they're more active, ciliated movement is not going to be sufficient, so they have a greater muscular contractions and control associated with the mantle cavity or the funnel to create water flow more efficiently through their body. In bivalves, we see that water enters the mantle cavity via what are called in-current siphons, and you can see those here, drawing water over the ctenidia for gas exchange, but also remember this is part of the process of bringing in food for feeding, and then that water then leaves with waste products through the excurrent siphon. And it shouldn't be surprising to you that the mantle itself, because it is a very large structure with a lot of surface area and highly vascularized, can also be used as a respiratory surface in some mollusks. Now, once you go to the terrestrial environment, though, gills are not going to cut it. In the terrestrial environment, you have to find another way to use your body tissues for gas exchange. Gills are not going to work because they're going to dry out too quickly. And remember, for a respiratory surface to work, it has to be kept moist and it has to have a large surface area that's highly vascularized. So the terrestrial gastropods have internalized their respiratory surface using these lungs, or a highly vascularized internal mantle cavity. They bring air in and out in a controlled manner through what is called a pneumostome. Pneumostome literally means breathing mouth. Mollusks typically have metanephridia, or sometimes just referred to as their kidney. The nephrostome receives nitrogenous waste from the pericardial cavity, and then this pushes it into the metanephridium, where waste products are emptied from the nephritiopore into the mantle cavity for removal from the body. And the typical waste product is typically some form of ammonia, but that's not going to work in the terrestrial gastropods. Remember, in the terrestrial environment, you have to worry about losing too much water. So the gastropods concentrate their waste into uric acid crystals to preserve more of the water that they have. The importance of osmoregulation varies. So most marine species are simply osmotic conformers, and so they just live in areas where the osmotic pressure doesn't change very much. So ocean water stays relatively constant unless you're too close to the shore and too close to a river valley, for example. But the freshwater species have to actively resorb salts and produce more dilute nitrogenous waste so they can get rid of that water that's constantly trying to enter their body. And we're still dealing with ectothermic animals. This is the first group that we've come to where asexual reproduction is pretty rare. So there are some gastropods that can reproduce through the production of parthenogenetic diploid eggs, but that's about it. Remember, we've talked in the previous groups that have the capability of binary fission or budding very commonly. But once we start getting into this more complex organs and organ systems and complex tissues, it's more and more difficult to be able to do that. And so the mollusks don't have that capability because of their morphological specialization. Now, when it gets to sexual reproduction, it's highly variable. And this is a point I want to make to you from here on out. Only if I tell you this is really unusual for this group and you need to know it, what I want you to be able to get as an idea of how amazingly variable animals are with regard to their sexual reproduction, with regard to monoecious and dioecious and oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. So I want you just to get a sense of how diverse this is within and among groups. Don't remember which groups are monoecious, dioecious from here on out, unless I specifically say this is kind of unusual that this group only has one, right? So I'll point out when you really need to know it. But it's really variable in the mollusks. So they're both monoecious, dioecious. Some show protandry or protogeny. Okay, so this is a situation. Protandry is where you start off life as male, and then as you get bigger, you turn to female. Protogeny is the reverse. You start off as female, and then once you get larger, you turn to male. So protandry is more common in species where you get more bang for your buck by being a large female because you can produce larger eggs late in life. Protogeny is typically associated with species that have male dominance. So if you're a small male, you're not going to be very lucky, so you better start off life as female. But as you get bigger, you can become more dominant and have a higher fitness by showing that dominance as a very large dominant male. Mollusks also show a variety of internal and external patterns of fertilization. Gametes can also be released in a variety of ways, either through the nephritiopores or through specialized gonopores. And there's some really cool courtship behavior seen in some mollusks. So some of the monoecious snails, so snails that are both male and female, will do something very similar to what we saw in the free-living flatworms. Remember we talked about penis fencing. These snails will come together and eject a love dart into their partner. That's what it's been called. There's probably not much love associated with it. This is probably, again, associated with sperm competition, again, like what we saw with the penis fencing. What it may do is allow more efficient sperm transfer and then greater sperm acceptance by the darted individual. So why would you be more likely to take the sperm of that individual if they dart you? Well, because you may be injured in some way, and it decreases the likelihood that the darted individual is going to mate again. So kind of like what we talked about in penis fencing, if you lose in penis fencing, or if you lose and you receive a love dart in this situation, you better go ahead and accept that sperm and commit most of your resources in using those sperm to fertilize your eggs so that you can produce some individuals. But if you're the successful love darter in this situation, you might be able to produce sperm very cheaply and fertilize more eggs by getting in these interactions with more individuals. And here you can see the copulatory organs, what's referred to as the penis, is actually on the heads of these snails that are in this courtship display. Some male cephalopods, as I mentioned, have these really complex courtship displays using really rapid changes in color to impress females in some cases, so it may influence female mate choice, but it could also be associated with trying to exert dominance relative to other males as a way to indicate that you're more likely to beat them in a fight if combat ensues. And so it's a more efficient way of communicating, hey, we don't even need to fight about this because I'm more likely to win, which can benefit both partners and both of the potential contestants in that situation, so that none of them get injured in the long run. Some species do have an organ of intromission, and so I mentioned the penis in the gastropods extends from the head. In cephalopods, they have these modified arms for the insertion of a spermatophore, or a packet of sperm, into the female mantle cavity, as you can see in this figure. Development is spiral cleavage, and typically the blastopore becomes the mouth because these are protostomes. Most do show holoblastic cleavage because they're really relatively isolecithal, but meroblastic cleavage is seen in some species that have a more telolecithal, large yolky eggs, like we see in many of the cephalopods. Some do have internal fertilization, as I mentioned, with some of the cephalopods and the gastropods doing the love dart courtship. And they may have some ovoviviparous brooding of the young before the release and increase the chance that they'll survive. But in most cases, species are oviparous, and they will show development of various larval forms, the first of which is called the trochophore larva. So this is what a trochophore larva looks like. It's like a cone on top of a cone with this ciliated band running across the equator, and then these tufts of cilia on the top and the bottom, with this very simple gastrovascular cavity going through the larval form. Later in development, many of these develop into what's called a veliger larva, seen in bivalves and aquatic gastropods. And some freshwater mussels have a modified form of the veliger larva called the glochidia larva. The glochidia larva looks like a very angry baby bivalve with these nasty little hook-like extensions of its shell and these byssal threads. Now, these structures are associated with part of the life history of the glochidium larva. These are parasitic larvae that attach to the gills of host fish. So these are modifications for the attachment of this parasitic form. But how do they get to the fish? Well, this is another modification associated with this behavior. The parent mussel has an extension of its mantle that looks in many cases like a fish. So it's actually producing a lure to attract a potential host fish, and then it puffs a bunch of these Glaucidia larvae at the fish, where they then attach to the gills and they continue the life cycle. So this is basically trickery to bring the fish closer to them so that they can attach their larvae. So these larval forms aren't going to make it in a terrestrial mollusk, and so the terrestrial mollusks show direct development, so the terrestrial gastropods. The other thing that gastropods do is they have a synapomorphy called torsion. This is a bizarre pattern of development where we see twisting of the internal organs and organ systems, including which means that we have some really weird orientations associated with the ctenidia, the nephridiopores, and the anus. They end up actually above the head in gastropods. Why this has happened, no one has been able to explain. There doesn't appear to be any clear adaptive explanation for this. And in fact, some gastropods have evolved what we call detorsion, kind of straightening things back out, where it probably is more beneficial. So here's why torsion itself wouldn't be a good idea. So here we have the head, we have the digestive tract that goes through this twist, and look at where the anus is opening up. Right above the head, which this mantle cavity right here is also where the ctenidia is, so they're defecating onto their head and into their gills. Don't see any real evolutionary advantage to that. It was probably a detrimental mutation that just got fixed in the early ancestor, all the gastropods, and some of them have simply evolved detorsion to straighten this out. So it looks like bivalves and gastropods can commonly live to 1 to 15 years. Now, some only live for 1 or 2 years and only reproduce once, so they're simiparous species, but many others are iteroparous, and so they grow slowly, take longer to sex and mature, and reproduce throughout their life. This is seen in a lot of cases, and this is particularly true of the long, slow growth and long lifespan in species living in colder waters. They can live more than 100 years. And the ocean quahog may live up to 400 or more years. Now, ironically, the smartest group here, the cephalopods, which have the greatest kind of neurological development, actually have really short lifespans. Some live less than a year old. Most only live 1 or 2 years. The nautiloids are the exception to this. The nautiloids have been known to live for 20 or more years. But octopi and squid just generally don't live very long. As far as defenses, we talked about how the shell in itself is just in general a good defensive structure. But there have been studies to show that the shell has thickened areas in some areas that are most vulnerable, but it's not uniformly thick. And they have these really bizarre extensions many times that are extending from the shell. What these do is they provide against predators being able to get an adequate grip. So crabs that can't get just the right break force grip on a shell may protect those shells by just having these little extensions coming off of them. Some of the more delicate, long, spiny ones may be more associated with helping benthic species provide some stability in soft sediment, sandy surfaces. But as I mentioned, there has been the secondary loss of shells in numerous lineages, and in that case, you have to defend yourself in a couple of ways. One is hide, be camouflage, and so their chromatophores and epithelial coloring can help them remain hidden. But in some species, they're doing the exact opposite. They're showing aposematic coloration. So nudibranchs sometimes have these bright patterns that are indicating that they have unfired nematocysts or toxins that they've sequestered from sponges and cnidarians as a defense mechanism. So they're warning potential predators, you better stay away because I could hurt you or make you sick. Some cephalopods have similar capabilities as well. So this is the blue ringed octopus, which has venomous bites, and so it's trying to warn you of that with this aposematic coloration. Cephalopods can also release a cloud of mucus and ink from their ink sacs when they're attacked. This can be both a chemical deterrent in itself, but as they're swimming away, the ink stays in the location where the attack may have been focused. And so the predator is visually tracking this dummy target while the cephalopod actually swims to safety. Mollusks can be found in really dense groups, but sometimes these are just really simple aggregations of individuals at something like oyster beds, and there's not really any complex behavioral interactions, no true social system going on. But in some species, at least a dense aggregation may be needed for successful reproduction. So in the Caribbean queen conch, shown here, apparently they can only spawn and reproduce successfully if there are relatively dense populations to be had to coordinate their reproduction, release of gametes, and uptake of gametes to lead to successful reproduction. And this has been a problem, and so it's led to slow recovery of this species that is being overly consumed because of the beauty of the shells themselves. Squid can form these large schools which do show complex behaviors, so individuals can compete for dominance in their social systems, and this influences mate competition, and mate choice is oftentimes seen of females choosing males depending on the qualities that they are communicating to them. So they can be highly social. There are quite a few symbiotic interactions between mollusks and other organisms. So many mollusks have mutualistic epizoic animals. So epizoic means an animal living on another animal. So these are animals that are actually living on their shells. So in some cases, you will see sponges or cnidarians or feather duster worms, which we'll cover in the next lecture, growing on the shells. Now, these can actually provide some benefits, so this can be a mutualism. They can provide some camouflage and chemical defense. And we also see that there can be mutualistic endosymbiotic bacteria. We can see that in other organisms, and also endosymbiotic protozoan. So in some of the deep sea volcanic vent living mollusks, they contain endosymbiotic bacteria that are used associated with the ctenidia to oxidize sulfur compounds that they're getting from those thermal vent flows of water, and they're converting that sulfur into a energy source for themselves, but then their host can actually rob them of some of that. Giant clams have photosynthetic zooanthellae in their mantle, and if you look at these giant clams, they're usually found in relatively shallow waters, so that there's enough light penetrating, in relatively clear water, so there's enough light transmission effectively to get to their mantle and the photosynthetic zooanthellae that they're housing. And they actually keep their mantles exposed, so their shells slightly open and their mantle exposed to the sun for greater photosynthetic capability. So as I mentioned, this is a big group with a huge range of habitats that match their morphological diversity. So they're marine, freshwater, and terrestrial habitats, polar waters, so tropical waters, and all kinds of terrestrial environments as well. And as a matter of fact, the largest group, the gastropods, are found in all three of these major environmental types. Most of the aquatic species are benthic as adults, but they do show pelagic larval forms that are used for dispersal. We have surface dwellers, borers, burrowers, and they're found at all different ocean depths. Mollusks are very important to humans. They serve as an important source of food, jewelry, art, and other cultural items. They represent about 9% of the world's commercial fishery production. And so losses of and damage to the molluscan community could result in about $100 billion of economic damage by the year 2100. And this is in large part due to climate change, as we'll see. So what are some of the challenges that are facing natural mollusk communities? Well, introduced mollusk species can cause a major problem to natural communities of mollusks. So introduced species can outcompete the native species and drive them to extinction. And introduced zebra mussels are a big problem to humans because they can clog industrial coolant systems that are used associated with power plants at lakes. They can also attach themselves to boat structures and other dock-like structures and cause a major problem for humans directly. And there's also significant negative effects of increased ocean temperatures and ocean acidification. So we see that there is a loss of cold water habitats that has led to greater competition from the invasion of warmer water species that are disrupting natural communities of mollusks. And both increased temperatures and acidification appear to work together to cause some problems in the development of various larval forms of mollusks and also in the reduction of the shell formation because of primarily ocean acidification in adults. So in review, this is a big group. We're just kind of focused on select clades, the gastropods, the bivalves, and cephalopods, and know the representatives of those, what those terms mean, which animals fit in that group. They're triploblastic bilateral eucoelomates that show very variable degrees of cephalization, primarily depending upon their locomotory abilities. They have a mantle and mantle cavity with ctenidia, with these specialized sensory structures, the ossifradia. As far as shells go, shells are prominent in many, but it's variable. Some have secondarily lost the shells partly, or it's been reduced or completely in others. They generally have very complex muscular systems, and they produce very delicious muscles. And they generally have very well-developed nervous system with an anterior nerve ring, which can be enlarged enough to make these ganglia that we refer to as a brain in certain groups. And then a ventral nerve cord that runs the length of the body connected by these transverse nerves. They have a variety of sensory structures, including the ossifradia, chemosensory and mechanosensory structures throughout the body, and then also well-developed eyes in some lineages, have evolved independently in different lineages. Locomotion is primarily associated with the foot, which sometimes forms a funnel in the cephalopods. Now, some of these don't want to move, so they're sessile, using byssal threads or shell secretions itself to glue themselves onto a hard substrate, or some just burrow or bore into surfaces so they don't move. Many of them are suspension or detritus feeders, using their gills as both a respiratory surface, and the mucus in them also helps to capture small food particles. A synapomorphy for the group is this tooth-like belt called the radula. And the cephalopods also have a beak-like jaw structure that breaks up food into smaller pieces even before it gets to the radula. And they have a very complex, complete digestive system that can include things like a crop, a gizzard, and the crystalline style. They have an open circulatory system with a prominent hemocoel. A main heart is found in the pericardial cavity, with accessory hearts and some that help to also move fluid. The one exception to this is we have a closed system in the much more active cephalopods. They need, because of their greater activity, they need more efficient transport of oxygen and nutrients throughout their body, and so they have this closed circulatory system. Respiration is primarily associated with the ctenidia and the marine and freshwater forms, but can also be supplemented by the mantle cavity itself. But when you get into the terrestrial environment, you have to internalize your respiratory surface, and so we see the evolution of a lung and a pneumostome in the gastropod. Excretion is through metanephridia. Reproduction, this is the first group we've come through where asexual reproduction is relatively rare. We do see parthenogenesis in some of the terrestrial snails. But when it gets to sexual reproduction, it's highly variable. And mating patterns also show some interesting mating patterns that I want you to know. But again, the variability in the sexual behavior as far as monoecious, dioecious, and oviparous, viviparous, those kinds of things, I just want you to know how variable that is. They show spiral holoblastic, for the most part, cleavage in their protostomes. The aquatic forms go through an early trochophore larva that then goes through a veliger stage in some lineages. And some lineages have a very modified veliger stage called the glochidia larval phase, the freshwater mussels, to know kind of the aspects of that parasitic part of their lifestyle. And the gastropods go through this weird pattern development called torsion, and some have evolved to get out of that and go through what's called detorsion. They're highly variable in their lifespan. Some are basically living a year or less, to some that can live hundreds of years old. Their primary defense in many cases is the shell, but they can also use camouflage, chemical defenses, and ink as defense mechanisms. Generally, they're not very social, but there is sociality and communication seen in some cephalopods, particularly some of the squid. As far as symbioses, they do have in many cases some epizoics living on them or endosymbionts living in them. And we talked about the wide range of habitats that they are found in, including the gastropods, which are the only mollusks that live in the terrestrial environment. I can almost guarantee you there's going to be a question on the exam about that. That say which group of mollusks is the only ones with terrestrial representative. It's the gastropods. There are some negative impacts due to introduced species and climate change, and this is going to be a big problem because there are many positive aspects of mussels in the fishing industry for humans.